Why should you design on paper before touching a game engine? Paper prototyping is a method used in the user-centered design process that helps developers create software that meets the user's expectations and needs. Let's break it down. User, or in the case of games, player-centered design is the design approach where, surprise, the player is the main focus of the process. In game development, that means that with every step of the way, we should be asking ourselves, how would this affect the player? After all, we're making the game for them to play, so we should always keep in mind how our decisions will impact their experience. But what is paper prototyping anyway? In short, a paper prototype usually consists of multiple sheets of paper with hand-drawn or printed out bits of information. For example, a level design. With these, the designer can quickly test and iterate on ideas without spending days on coding, which saves a great deal of time. I'll go into more detail about how to actually do this a bit later in the video, so stick around for that. But why should you use it in the first place? Paper prototyping is a form of rapid prototyping, meaning it's used for quick and dirty mock-ups that you can easily iterate on. For a design to work well, it usually needs to go through at least a couple of iterations. When you make those on paper instead of in engine, you'll save a lot of time. I could have spent almost a month on coding my first puzzle design, let alone on the other iterations that followed. With my paper prototypes, I spent only about a week or two going through multiple versions. If you've never used this technique before, you might think that it only applies to UI testing, since that's where it's most commonly seen, especially in mobile app development. But let me show you how you can use paper prototyping in almost every aspect of your game's design. You start by deciding on your concept, in my case, a simple puzzle design. This puzzle was quite simply a moving block puzzle with some music notation slapped on top of it. Then you take the base of your concept and figure out what aspect of it you want to test. In this puzzle, I wanted to see whether having to input the notes that appear on the blocks before moving them would make learning music notation more interesting than usual. Once you know your concept and what you want to test, you can start thinking about the layout. How are you going to convey your idea on paper? For this puzzle, it was quite simple, as I could reference the already existing block puzzles. The prototype itself was also straightforward. Cut out a few rectangles and write different music notes on them. Now, physically, there is no stopping the player from moving the block even if they get the answer wrong or don't answer at all. That is where the imagination aspect of paper prototyping comes into play. There are some things you just can't do with paper alone, for example, preventing the player from moving a piece. Instead, you'll have to explain what they can and can't do. Another term for this is Wizard of Ozing, which, of course, comes from the stories of the Wizard of Oz, who was no wizard at all, but simply played pretend as if he was. Wizard of Ozing is actually a big part of paper prototyping. In my puzzle, I didn't need it, but if, for example, you wanted to test some NPC interaction, you could simply act out the scene as if it were in-game. You would play the role of the NPC, while the tester plays the role of the player. In that scenario, you could either follow a set script with options for the tester to choose from, like the real game, or go for a more free-form version where a more natural conversation flows between the two. In this case, neither approach is wrong, but I'd use them at different stages of development. In early development, having a free-form conversation can spark ideas you might not have thought of yourself, but in later stages, I'd stick to a more set script to test the impact of that specific scene. Once you have tested your paper prototype with some players, which ideally are part of your target audience, it's time to iterate. Record your tests, and I do recommend this, so you can look back at what actually happened, not just what you remember happening. Review those recordings to see what players found interesting, exciting, confusing, bad, etc. Make a list of these aspects and decide which of these things you're going to try and improve. Remember, you don't have to change something just because one player mentioned it. The important thing to remember is the player experiencing the game in the way I designed it for them? If the answer is no, try to steer your design in the direction until it does. We're making games for the player, so their experience should always come first. From my first tests, it became clear that the puzzle felt disconnected from the game world. Players wanted a more diegetic experience rather than simply clicking buttons on a UI. That's how my second iteration came to life. Rather than moving a specific block out of the room, players now had to escape the room themselves by physically pushing and pulling the blocks in front of them. This required some changes into the puzzle's layout to make room for the player to physically stand in, but overall wasn't too difficult to manage. Making this second iteration only took me about a day or so. If I'd had to code this from scratch, it'd probably have taken me a few days or up to a week to do so. Now there are a few things to look out for when testing paper prototypes. With any form of testing, it is important that the questions remain as neutral as possible. For example, in a regular survey, you don't want to see questions such as, "Does this give you a euphoric feeling?" Instead, you'd want to formulate it like, "Does this give you a particular feeling? If yes, which one?" This way, you're not leading the tester or coloring the question, so to say. When testing, you should also remain neutral yourself. If you believe something might not work, you might unconsciously focus only on the moments that confirm your bias. That's another reason why recording your testing helps. So, paper prototyping is great for a lot of things, but it does have its limitations. So when does paper prototyping not work? Paper prototyping does not work for late-stage development and online or hybrid testing. Paper prototyping is a tool best used in the early stages of development, when you're quickly iterating on new ideas. In later stages, when your game already has lots of interconnected systems, it's often faster to test directly in engine. Another thing that does not work in paper prototyping is an online or hybrid form of testing. The core of paper prototyping is playing pretend and interaction. Removing the interaction part of it by having an online or hybrid test takes away from its effectiveness. So to summarize, the process consists of define your concept, choose what to test, design the layout, set the game rules, test and document, iterate. Things to look out for, biases and leading results, and paper prototyping cannot be used for late-stage development and online testing. Now you know what paper prototyping is, what it can be used for, and how to do it. It might feel a bit silly during your first few tests, but if you stick with it, it can become a great tool in your design arsenal. Happy designing. Not there. Oh. Who was no wizard. Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz. Breathe. Paper prototyping. Paper prototyping.